So I don't want to use the you, the impersonal you, I became compromised at the same time I was dedicating myself to getting at the truth so the truth would make us free. It was an astounding experience. Well, it served me well, this behavior that I engaged in, this ability to negotiate the bureaucratic hedgerows. And I gathered more and more power, more and more access. And at one particular point in 1972, I was briefly back at CIA headquarters, and I was so well thought of that I had been appointed to be the chief analyst of North Vietnamese policy in a little entity in the agency called the Vietnam Task Force. This task force serviced the president himself and contributed to the president's daily brief, Richard Nixon at the time, and it was heady stuff, right? And in any event, because of my performance on this task force, the director's special assistant for Vietnam, the director at this point was Bill Colby, friend of my father's. His special assistant, George Carver, loved what I was doing on the task force at Langley headquarters in 1972, and so proposed that I be sent back to Vietnam to interrogate the highest ranking prisoner we had ever captured. His name was Nguyen Van Thieu. Nguyen Van Thieu was head of the communist security apparatus for the Saigon City Party Committee, the communist cell in Saigon. He'd been captured in late 1970. No one knew who he was when he was captured. And it fell to, through pure circumstance, a young woman, Vietnamese woman I was working with. She was an interpreter. I spoke no Vietnamese. I spoke French. But when I was interrogating prisoners, I needed an interpreter unless the prisoner spoke French, which occurred from time to time. But in any case, I developed a relationship with Chi, this interpreter who handled my interrogation with prisoners. And at one point, she found out who Nguyen Van Thieu was in the simplest of ways. She didn't interrogate him. She took a photograph of him and went around to other prisoners in the National Interrogation Center, the principal detention center in Saigon. And she said, "You know this guy?" And one prisoner said, "Oh my," whatever the Vietnamese equivalent was, "Oh my God, that's not Tu Trung. That's not Tu Trung. That's Nguyen Van Thieu. He says he's Tu Trung. This man is head of the communist security apparatus. You've got pure gold. You've got the man, the person who helped organize the attack on the U.S. Embassy in 1968. He was formerly Ho Chi Minh's bodyguard. Nguyen Van Thieu single-handedly broke up CIA operations designed to send infiltrators into North Vietnam. That's what we were doing up until 1964, 65. We would send teams of trained South Vietnamese infiltrators into the North to try to undermine the North Vietnamese government. This guy, Nguyen Van Thieu, was head of their security at the time, intercepted one of the teams, got hold of his radio, and began sending out false signals to lure other infiltrating teams in, and he caught them. And he, in this way, Nguyen Van Thieu literally destroyed CIA operations directed to penetrate North Vietnam in the early 1960s. On the basis of this record, he was sent south in about 1967, maybe a little bit later, I forget exactly, but in any event, he was sent south to run their terror operations in Saigon. And he did it. He had blood on his hands up to his elbows. But he was a brilliant man. Brilliant man. One of the things that happened to me was I became, because of my interrogations, intimately acquainted with the enemy and their thinking. One of the ways we learned about the enemy was through letters that we captured on the bodies of North Vietnamese infiltrators who were killed along the Ho Chi Minh Trail system. We would pick up these letters, we would read them. In fact, they were used for counter-propaganda purposes. We would turn them over to CIA propagandists. We had a black operation known as Mother Vietnam, and they would beam messages and broadcasts and music programming to the enemy and read sections of letters that had been captured on the bodies of infiltrators. And they would use these letters to frame the most heart-rending messages for the enemy, designed to demoralize the enemy. The letters often dealt with reminiscences about lost families, people left back in North Vietnam. They reflected ambivalence on the part of North Vietnamese infiltrators. Many of them had no idea what they were doing. None, generally, had any idea of what communism meant. Many thought they were going south to roll back the neo-colonialists, not realizing the Americans resembled the French. Not at all. We weren't in Vietnam to colonize the place. But through these letters, you get a sense of what the enemy was thinking. And the enemy was thinking a lot of things. And I would not only did we use this information in our propaganda broadcast back to the enemy, but I used this information to help frame my interrogations so that I could actually speak the language of the enemy. And if you're an interrogator, it's a full-time educational experience, because you're constantly reading up on the enemy, reading documents, reading anything you can get hold of, so that when you're in the interrogation room, when I would go into the interrogation room, I would be able to speak the enemy's language. I would be able to spell the names of the North Vietnamese leadership correctly. We would use this information to educate ourselves on what the enemy was thinking. When I would go into an interrogation, I would have been thoroughly immersed in this information. When I went in to interrogate Nguyen Van Thieu, I had really good background information. Because of the genius of my interpreter, this woman Chi, I knew who he was. Only one American had ever interrogated this guy. And that American, a CIA guy named Peter Kapuska, he was from Eastern Europe, and so he argued communism with this prisoner. That was absurd. You were never going to win this argument, never going to convert him. What you had to do when you went in to interrogate a guy like Nguyen Van Thieu, you had to get to his guts. You had to get to his morality. You had to get to his family. Because if anything, a Vietnamese is family oriented, even a communist. When I went in to interrogate Nguyen Van Thieu, I knew one key thing about him besides his identity. And that was he had betrayed his father on the way up the party ladder. His father had been a dissident, not a dissident, he had been a moderate in communist terms. He didn't want to send the entire North Vietnamese army south. He wanted to keep some people home to build up communism in the north, to make sure that farmers and peasants had the manpower and the resources to make communism work in the north. So the moderates were actually the truest communists in the north. They didn't want to send men south to be expended on a crusade dreamed up by their leaders. I knew that Nguyen Van Thieu, who was a dedicated communist in the classic sense, had betrayed his father. He had fingered his father, denounced his father to the hardliners in Hanoi, because the father was not sufficiently communist or sufficiently wedded to the aggressive view of communism that though those who were prosecuting the war in the South embraced. I used this information with Ty. I kept going back to it. Why would you betray your father? And at length, he would become infuriated with me, and he'd say something he didn't mean to. I'd leave, I'd come back, and I'd say to him, "You told me this yesterday." And I would embellish what he told me. So as the months went on, I was with him for 6 months, he would lose track of what he told me. And everything was on my side, not on his side. Because from the moment he had been captured, he had been kept in total solitary seclusion, isolation. He was housed in a specially built snow white room. No windows. No windows. Never seen since he'd been captured daylight. The light in the room was always on. And the air conditioning was turned up full blast because it was thought, Vietnamese thought, if they were exposed to cold air, their veins would shrink. So turning up the air conditioning was psychological torture on this guy, for this guy. And when I entered the interrogation and began interrogating this guy, this is where we were, in the snow white room, overly air conditioned, with a prisoner who had not seen the light of day, who was suffering from exhaustion. But boy, was this guy something. He had managed to condition himself, I guess through his body chemistry, to determine what time it was. He knew when breakfast was to be served, when dinner was due, even though he was in this isolation chamber. And I immediately stopped physical torture of this guy. The South Vietnamese wanted to beat him up. When you're in an interrogation situation, you want to establish, and I did want to establish, absolute rapport with the guy. An interrogation is like a love affair. The two people have to be symbiotic. They have to trust the other person. All this stuff you hear about waterboarding and all, it's baloney. It doesn't work. Oh yeah, you can force a prisoner to tell you the name of a unit, or unit location, but if the prisoner is being beaten to death, if he's being tortured, if he is being fed drugs, you can't trust a word he says about strategic intelligence. You can't do it. So I was always opposed, listen to me, for pragmatic reasons, the torture of any prisoner. Because if you torture a prisoner, he can't talk to you. You can't interact with him. And my job was interacting to the point of getting at the truth. And one of the instruments I used with Nguyen Van Thieu was the story of his father. And because he was so exhausted, he would lose track of what he told me in a previous session. And in addition to interrogating him, I arranged to interrogate 9 of his captured comrades, all held in the National Interrogation Center. And I would go to one, I'd get a piece of information, I'd go to the next one, and then I would go back to Nguyen Van Thieu, and I would lead him to believe he had told me what I had just gotten from another prisoner because he was so exhausted. I used a technique called the jump cut technique. I would interrogate him, Ty. In the midst of the interrogation, I would suddenly stop one train of thought and switch to another. You do this enough, and a prisoner who's exhausted in solitary confinement will forget where he is, what he's told you, and you can begin to play on his mind. And that's the way I interrogated Nguyen Van Thieu. The CIA's analysis of my performance was released years later, declassified. And I was credited with having set up an ongoing dialogue, substantive dialogue with Nguyen Van Thieu, and having gathered from him exploitable intelligence. And I tell you this because people brag about themselves, a lot of Vietnam veterans, CIA veterans from the war, about what they did. I happen to be in a unique position of having had all of my records released and declassified in various court proceedings. So you can read the CIA's own analysis of the way I handled this guy. And I was credited with having done what I was sent there to do. But I never met, put it this way, there were only a few people in Vietnam I really came to admire. I always admired the American GIs, goes without saying. But I mean, I'm talking about my own colleagues, the ambassador, that coterie. I came to really admire Nguyen Van Thieu. This guy would get up using his internal clock at 6 o'clock in the morning, and he would do calisthenics. He knew that was the time. And by the way, one of the first things I did to throw him off balance was to change the time his meals were served, so that when it was midnight, he was getting breakfast. And I felt that would contribute to his disorientation. But I came to admire him because he was a true communist ideologue, patriot. He believed that the decadent Americans were trying to take over his country. He was bloody wrong. I wasn't going to argue that with him. I was going to argue that he betrayed his family, personal relationships, and he got mad at that, and he would talk. He also resented that I was so young. He was in terms of the communist hierarchy, way up the party chain of command. He was one of the most important party cadre ever captured, and ever, in fact, to operate in the South. He was like a general in their intelligence apparatus. So here I am, in my blue shirt, very young, and he resented. He thought he was being dissed by having to deal with someone so callow and inexperienced as I. And so he would sneeringly brush aside a question or whatever. And I used that, his anger, his resentment of me, to get to him. I want to flash forward a little bit here because I want to finish the story of Nguyen Van Thieu. When I wrote my memoir of Vietnam, Decent Interval, I thought that Nguyen Van Thieu was dead. It was common wisdom in the agency that right before the fall of Saigon, he was to have been taken out by the South Vietnamese jailers who were keeping him. He had not been exchanged, by the way, he had not been exchanged during the ceasefire period in 1973, when both sides were supposed to give up their prisoners to the other side. John McCain was a prisoner that the North Vietnamese had. They gave him back to us. And Nguyen Van Thieu was supposed to be exchanged. And Nguyen Van Thieu was supposed to be exchanged. It hadn't happened. The South Vietnamese had kept him for the next 2 years in that Snow White room in solitary confinement. I didn't know this because when the ceasefire occurred, all Americans were withdrawn from major interrogation. So I left him believing that he was going to be released. The final session I had with him, I told him, I said, I'm going to tell you something that's going to seem incredible to you, but we're on the verge of a ceasefire and you're going to be released. And I'll never forget, he was this magnificent, scary bastard. And he began trembling, just like this. And he squeaked out through the interpreter that if I was telling him the truth, this was the happiest day of his life. That's what he said to me. The South Vietnamese who were running the interrogation center were furious that I had told them about the ceasefire accord and the guaranteed release of prisoners. They wanted to keep him, and they did. They never released him. He was kept to the last day of the war. When I left Vietnam, I had no idea he'd been kept, but the common wisdom in the CIA when after Saigon fell was that Thai had been killed by his jail keeps. He'd been thrown out of an aircraft at 30,000 feet or whatever, 10,000 feet. And when I wrote my memoir of the fall of Saigon, I included that supposition in my narrative. Actually, it's one of the few things in my book that was proven to be inaccurate. In the second edition, I corrected it. What had actually happened was that Nguyen Van Thieu, just before the communists took over Saigon, knew that he was going to be killed. And when the jail keeps came to him to do the job on him, he said, wait a minute. You're going to need somebody to vouch for me when the North Vietnamese army, for you, when the North Vietnamese army shows up. And I'll do it. I'll save your life. I'll keep my comrades from killing you if you keep me alive. And they did. When the communists seized Saigon, the communists located Nguyen Van Thieu. He was still in his snow-white cell. They couldn't find a key. They had to break through the roof of the cell to rescue the son of a bitch. I didn't know this. I didn't know this had happened. The only way I finally discovered what had happened to Nguyen Van Thieu is that years later he wrote his own memoirs of the war, devoted 40 pages to my interrogation of him, and essentially, in effect, credited me with having saved his life because I'd given him information that he was to be released, entitled to be released under the Paris Accords, the peace accords. And he'd used this to prevent his jail keeps from killing him. So in a way, he owed his life to me. And I had hoped, years later, to go and visit him in North Vietnam. I told some documentarians about him, and they went and in fact interviewed him. I was hoping he and I would reunite. Nguyen Van Thieu died before that could happen. His repatriation to the North had not been a happy experience because the communists thought that while he was under interrogation and in my hands, he'd given away the store, all the secrets he knew. And so they refused to welcome him back. And for 30 years, Nguyen Van Thieu was persecuted by the revolutionaries he had served because, in part, because of my own sessions with him. Le Duc Tho, who negotiated the Paris Peace Agreement with Henry Kissinger, was the principal persecutor of Nguyen Van Thieu. The principal persecutor. And one of the people that they interviewed about Thai's activities was the woman who had been my interpreter in my sessions with Thai. She'd been captured after the fall of Saigon. Le Duc Tho interrogated her, Thai interrogated her in an effort to clarify what he'd done. The reason I bring this up is that the revolution ate up one of its best. After the fall of Saigon, the leaders of North Vietnam disbelieved Nguyen Van Thieu because he'd been my captive. They thought he wasn't sufficiently communist. The revolution ate up its best man. Only in the end, with the change of regime in Hanoi, was he finally rehabilitated and died a hero of the people. in the North. But boy, did I admire this guy. Even though he once told me if he caught me in the street, he'd shoot me down like a dog. And I had said to him, probably I'd do the same thing with you. At one point after the fall of Saigon, I was hired by the BBC to go back to Vietnam and to revisit the embassy and what have you for a documentary they were doing. And one of the people I interviewed in Hanoi was Mai Chi To, Lê Đức Thô's brother, who had been the patron for Nguyen Van Thieu. And I told Mai Chi To that Thai had died as an honorable man, not knowing the guy had survived, not suspecting that Thai might be in the shadows behind the camera crew laughing in his teeth at what I was saying, because I didn't know that he had survived. In fact, in retrospect, it's a wonder I wasn't arrested and interrogated, because the North Vietnamese leadership was so determined to figure out whether or not Nguyen Van Thieu had stayed faithful to the revolution. After the fall of Saigon, one of the things I did to try to square accounts is that I went to the North Vietnamese embassy or mission in Paris, and I let them know that I had interrogated Nguyen Van Thieu. And I said, please send word to his wife that he died an honorable man, not knowing that he was still alive. But that's how attached I was to Nguyen Van Thieu, how admiring of him I was. And I think about him not because I idealized his ideology, which I didn't. He was a terrorist, he was a terrible man. But because as a human being, in the most horrible circumstances, he had held himself together. How could you not admire that? He had been responsible for American deaths. He was a killer himself. But he was a study in brilliant commitment to his cause. And that, my friends, is one of the reasons we didn't win in Vietnam, because there were too many Nguyen Van Thieus on the other side. They weren't right, but brother, were they committed.